Hi guys, Miss Yandell here. I hope you guys are having a really great week. I hope that you are enjoying all of the study we're doing in this leg of the journey in American Lit since the Civil War. This week we are going to spend our time and fix our attention on Stephen Crane. And initially, I had not planned on doing this. I'll just be honest, we try to cover as many authors as we can. But when I really started thinking about it, I thought that Crane was someone that we needed to have some kind of understanding of. He's a very important writer, as you have read. He's an important realist, and he, by many standards, is a major modern naturalist in American literature. And certainly you can see that in his works. I mean, they're both very realistic, but the way in which he writes is very naturalistic. So if you've had an introduction to literature, you know what we're talking about when we're talking about these kinds of movements in American literature, about realism and naturalism. But I just want to remind you that naturalism is often very much about the power of nature and the frailty of man, and the issues men have in trying to control something they cannot control. And I pulled out, in anticipation of this lecture, I pulled out some of my notes from the Introduction to Literature class, which discuss naturalism. So I want to just remind you all of some of the notes that we've taken, and we take in an Introduction to Literature course. One thing about it is, in naturalism, this is a movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries primarily. You still see this kind of writing influencing authors today and artists today. One thing that you need to know, and I'm skipping through some of this, but I think that really resonates in Stephen Crane's work, you need to know what naturalists believe. And one thing it says here that I think really mirrors what he has to say is the naturalistic view of human beings is that of animals in the natural world, responding to environmental forces and internal stresses and drives, none of which they can control or understand. Remember that it's very dependent upon modern science, including Isaac Newton, and his idea of a mechanistic determinism. Crane, one of the works we're going to look at, one that I've included in the poetry that I've posted online, has very much to do with that. It's that the world keeps going, oblivious to what's happening to us. And then, of course, Charles Darwin is part of this science of this time in this movement. Darwin's sense of biological determinism and the inclusive metaphor of competitive jungle that it has used perhaps more than any other. And we see that in The Open Boat. And some of the other pieces, including one of the discussion board options for you with Maggie, a Girl of the Streets. I can't wait for you to look at some of the summaries of the pieces that Crane wrote as well. Very much a part of this naturalistic movement. Also, the other one that's listed here is Sigmund Freud. So we see psychology as coming into play. And here it says from the literary term book and literary handbook, Freud's view of determinism of the inner and subconscious self. So I think with Crane's work, you see psychology at play all of the time. There's a major emphasis on what's going on internally inside of man, and the frustration that comes with being completely a victim or out of control and powerless in these natural elements. We will talk about that. The Open Boat's very much about that as well. I mean, big time. So one thing about naturalism that literature tends to emphasize either a biological or socioeconomic determinism. You see both of those in Crane's works. Humans, very importantly, are seen as the victims of destiny or fate. And we hear this, the terminology, when you read The Open Boat, fate is mentioned in this short story. So, and then being a victim of destiny and fate. And what does that mean? And who do you blame? Who's in charge of all of that? It's very interesting, guys, what we're about to get into. I find it very interesting, although these are not necessarily ideas that I use to get through my everyday life. It's certainly something you want to think about. Okay, it says, whichever view is taken, the naturalist strives to be objective in the presentation of material. They're not trying to make it more than it is. Their intention is to just tell it like it is, realistically speaking, and leave it at that, not to read more into it. It's amoral, in other words, not judgmental, in the view of the struggle in which human animals, listen to that terminology, find themselves. It's neither condemning nor praising human beings for actions beyond their control. It's pessimistic about human capabilities, life. The naturalists seem to feel is a vicious trap. You see that in The Open Boat. Frank in its portrayal of human beings as animals driven by fundamental urges such as fear, hunger, and sex. Two of the major naturalistic writers in American literature are Stephen Crane and Theodore Dreiser. And initially I had planned on including Dreiser in this week's discussion, but the discussion on Crane is, it's enough in itself this week. And you'll notice with the assignments that I gave you the same number of assignments, but I really want you to think about Crane. I don't think a lot of people spend a lot of time learning about his work or learning about his ideas. So I think it's essential for you to see his work and to understand it in the context especially of the movements in American literature. So one thing that I wanted to do was talk about some of the poetry of his. And speaking of fate and destiny, and remember that human beings are seen as the victims. So let's take a look, if you will. I'll pause here a moment, but go ahead and click on A Man Said to the Universe. That's what we're going to look at first. So if you want to make a copy of that or open another window, I'll pause here just a moment. The poetry of Crane's is not overly complicated. I actually love his brevity. He says so much in just a few lines. This one is 5 lines. And so the title line is the first line of poetry, and we are told, a man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." Is that how it sounded? No. Has an exclamation point there. So you see this, a man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." So when we're talking about how a man in relation to the universe feels and responds, we can see it in 5 lines. So the man is so struggling to get attention from the universe, craves a relationship with the universe. "Sir, I exist!" exclamation point. And then the universe responds with this answer, "However, the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." So here's Crane's idea of the responsibility of the universe to do anything for anyone. And it says, so what is essentially the answer. The answer of the universe here is non-committal, to say the least. I would tell you this, that honestly for a naturalist and for Crane, if he could have written it this way, he would have, I believe. He had to write it the way it is so that you get the idea of behind it and get the idea of the message he's trying to send. But I've always said for many years that I believe that Crane would have written it this way if he could get away with it. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." Nothing. You see, because honestly, a response of nothing would mean that the universe didn't even bother to respond. The universe does respond here, but Stephen Crane is doing what he can. If he just wrote it as he meant it, like with the blank space, I'm sure, that's a better version of it, but you'd have to have like a whole discussion or some kind of star and at the bottom some kind of explanatory note about why there's nothing after "Sir, I exist." But ultimately for Crane and others in this particular movement, the universe would never respond. So think about that option as well. So this one talking about fate, talking about so what? There's an utter disconnect between mankind and the great scheme of things, mankind and any notion of creator. It's very much Isaac Newton's mechanistic that the world is a machine and it will run over you. In naturalism, they focus on nature as being a very destructive force, and it is. And I say this in Introduction to Literature class. But one of the greatest things for me, one of the big laughable moments is when my family and I get to go to the beach and there are these signs that say, there's sharks in the water. Well, hello, that's where they live. And I'm sorry, they're not going to read your sign that says sharks, stay back. This is a sign telling you to stay back. They're not going to read that. They don't care. And if you get in their way and they're hungry, they're going to bite you and eat you. Do you know what I mean? But we have these kinds of crazy notions that we control nature and we don't. And I could say more, but I say more in Introduction to Literature. The other piece that I really wanted us to look at and refer to is another poem by him called I Saw a Man Pursuing the Horizon. Doesn't that sound ambitious, right? I saw a man pursuing the horizon. The first line itself repeats that, but I want to make a distinction here is that the narrator of this poem is not the one pursuing the horizon. He's watching someone else pursue it, not making the effort himself. I think that's kind of an interesting way to start off the analysis of this poem as well. I saw a man pursuing the horizon. Round and round they sped. I was disturbed at this. I accosted the man. It is futile, I said. You can never. You lie, he cried, and ran on. Once again, in just few words, you have this inner angst of Crane and this entire movement spilling onto the page in such brevity. I'm telling you, it's a master author, a master poet who can put so much in so few lines. I appreciate poetry of all shapes and sizes, but this kind of poetry, Crane really blows my mind because, here he is, he says, these people are chasing after things they're never going to find and they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear if it's not something that they're going to do, be able to do, or be able to find. They want you to cheer them on and let them run, run, run. And we might say, by today's standards, it's none of your business. Let me do what I want to do. If you want to expend all that energy, go ahead. Whatever your response is to that, I ask you to think about how this is still a reality today. You know what we do in my classes is we think about how does this apply to our life today? Sometimes when you tell people, hey, that's not going to work out. Hey, you're wasting time and energy. They just don't want to listen. You lie, he cried and ran on. I wonder what else we chase after. That's just a massive waste of time and energy, precious time and energy that we have on this earth. I don't know, something to think about. The third piece that I wanted to look at with you today is from the open boat. There are just a couple of moments. I know you're going to read this on your own, but there were a couple of moments that kind of tie into what we're talking about, and I really don't want you to miss it. I realize that this may not be your style, this may not be something you would read on your own, but that's kind of the whole point of these classes, right? Is that you read material that you wouldn't otherwise read or understand, be pushed to understand material you wouldn't even probably care to otherwise. I hope when you finish Crane that not necessarily that you say, oh yeah, this is my whole idea of life and I embrace it. I'm less interested in that. What I'd like you to say is, wow, that's something really powerful to think